There had been conflict between the European empires in North America for much of the 18th century, but little changed in regards to territorial gain or loss until the end of the Seven Years' War in 1763. The conflict over the frontier between French and the British empires are what really led to the Seven Years' War. Here you see the French Empire in the blue and the British Empire in the red, and the disputed territory with the striped red and blue lines. Native Americans were living in this territory and were maintained fairly good relationships with the French with whom they traded, but many other people were looking to move into this region. American fur traders, for example, and other settlers. Fur traders wanted to move west into the Ohio River Valley, and Virginia planters wanted to develop this area for tobacco crops. So, as there was more and more pressure from American colonists moving into this disputed territory that was controlled by the French, the French decided to build and occupy more forts in order to secure the region. In 1754, a young George Washington, who you see pictured here, attacked one of these French outposts. The French and the Indians resisted and retaliated, and George Washington and his troops were forced to surrender. Shortly after that, in 1755, the British sent nearly 3,000 troops against the French, and almost 2,000 were killed or wounded in a French and Indian ambush. The British were quite embarrassed by this loss and really hesitated to commit to further war. They finally declared war, however, in 1756, and although Britain initially struggled, the tide eventually turned by 1758. By 1763, Britain had won the war and signed the Peace of Paris, which gave them much more territory in North America. So some of the outcomes of the Seven Years' War was that Britain became the world's strongest empire. They gained Canada, Florida, and all the land east of the Mississippi River. France completely lost its North American empire. In order to pay for the war, Britain had to increase taxes on the American colonies. Britain had to go into a lot of debt to pay for this war and expected the American colonists to pay what they perceived as their fair share. Also, the bond between the colonies grew stronger throughout the fighting of this war. Before the war, each colony really kept to themselves and didn't communicate so much with other colonies, and the relationship was based much more on their relationship with Britain itself rather than other colonies. But throughout this war, the colonists got to know one another, fought alongside one another, communicated and organized with one another more effectively, and the bond between the colonies grew. Also, tensions increased between these American colonists and the Native Americans. Now that Britain controlled more area, these American colonists were looking to move in to more lands that they could pursue their economic interests and either farm or look to expand the fur trade. And the British Empire was not really letting the American colonists move westward because they didn't want to have further conflict with Native Americans that lived there. So in 1763, they passed the Proclamation Line of 1763, which limited American expansion, the colonist expansion, to the Appalachian Mountains. They weren't allowed to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains because the British did not want to be called into another war with the Native Americans that were living in that area. They wanted to avoid future conflict. And this really upset the American colonists because they saw this as the British being oppressive and against their interests in pursuing their economic dreams of moving westward. So this, along with the increase in taxes, really strained the relationship between Britain and the colonies. And this set the American colonies on a future path toward revolution and eventually independence.